G'day, we're going to start assembling the crankcase today with clean parts. This is a cleaned up crankcase with bearings that have been removed and swapped with the other crankcase. There wasn't actually much difference once all the bearings were cleaned in Kero and washed in water and blown out and oiled again. They all feel good. So how did I select them? Well, the ones out of the original 94 engine, the one that had blown up, there was a slight straw colour to at least one side of each bearing. I wondered whether that was from a little bit of overheating. I've done that by putting a bearing in the oven before I fitted it to a shaft, and I had it at too high a temperature and it came out of the oven with a bit of a straw colour, and I figured I'd stuffed it because you're only supposed to heat a bearing to about a maximum of 140 degrees, and I think this one had climbed up to like 200. So all of these are the 5 bearings that you see here are all out of the spare engine fitted into the 94 crank casing. I'm happy with how that's gone. I put the bearings in the freezer and just used a hot air gun to heat the aluminium, and they all pretty much just dropped in. At least 3 out of the 5 just dropped in. They're all good. A couple of them need retainers put on them. There's an oil seal to go on that one, a retainer to go on that one. I just used some light oil in each of the bearings. I think there was a little bit of grit in all of the bearings at one stage, and after washing them in Kero and water and giving them a bit of a blowout with compressed air, they all of them, both the blown engine and this engine, seem fine. So I'm going to go ahead and put the bearings in the other half of the crankcase. Again, I've selected all of the bearings from spare engine to fit to the 94 crankcase. Okay, this is the other half loaded with washed bearings. The case has come out pretty good with a wash in kerosene and some warm soapy water. The bearings all pressed in nice. This one here's got a little bit of a rattle to it, not too bad. Roll the bearing in there retained by this pipe, which I think is a breather that finds its way out through that hose there. Pretty happy with how the cleanliness of this. This one's the bearing for the end of the barrel input shaft. The clutch is on the other side of this one. This is the secondary shaft. Yes, I'm going to try and put it together as clean as possible now. This is the oil filler hole. It never seemed to get particularly clean down there. I've just installed the end of the selector barrel there with its 2 retaining screws. I'm going to put the indexing and interlock on next. Just finished installing the change mechanism that drags this barrel around. That's how it clicks around. This is a little detent that makes it hold the cog. So you see it bouncing over those little lumps round the side there. This mechanism here ratchets backwards and forwards like this to pull or push that barrel around. And the actual gear lever comes through this hole going right through the bike. It rocks that backwards and forwards. It's not going to do it without the shaft in there at the moment, which then activates this lever to pull. I just made that work then, you see. I didn't think I would make. That's pulling it in one direction there. It pulls and it pushes as well, but it's not pushing. I can't make it push with one finger. I can make it pull. So you can see that's indexing that barrel around, and that's That's how the sequential system works. Doesn't normally do a full turn. It does nearly a full turn because from neutral through to fifth gear, and then it's got to go back the other way. I can keep pulling it around there because none of the forks are on it on the other side at the moment, and it's happy to just do a full lap. But that's how that works. You can see, I think that popped out. You can see the claw on this end, and there's a similar claw on that end that pull on those series of pins that are under this. There's 6 pins under this cap, and those claws push or pull on those pins. So this is the barrel, and these are the 2 sequential gearbox shafts. You see the traces on the barrel here are what the selector forks run in as the barrel clicks around. See how it clicks like that? This is the reversing groove at the bottom here, and that's the neutral position at the end of the run of these other traces. And that's how that clicks around, and the forks work in grooves to move the dogs up and down. There's 2 of them on this, or there's 3 of them on this shaft. One underneath there that the reverse operates on, and there's one in the middle of this shaft here that moves up and down. So there's 4 forks that need to be located. They all have a trace on this barrel to follow, and they run on 2 shafts, one in here and one in here, that the selector fork rails. So that's what I'm fitting next. I've got the reverse idler in place around this side. It runs on the big cog on the bottom there, as well as a cog tucked in right underneath. You can just see it under there, and that cog under there moves up when reverse is selected to engage properly. So we're getting there. It's just a matter of doing it methodically. What I wanted to just show here, this track here in the barrel, you can see around this way, it doesn't vary. It's flat all the way there. And the dog here is not engaged up or down. So those shafts are rolling together as if it's in neutral. Now as I roll that around, and it wants to go down there. Now it's not going down because nothing's moving, but if I move it, there it did pop down. You see, I don't know whether you saw the dog here engaged. If I keep moving this barrel, it's in the down position. You can see it moved from all the way up. There's the dog that the teeth on there engaged with when it went down. It's moved all the way up to engage similar dogs at the top, and so it's engaged there at the moment. And if I go back the other way, it's gone all the way down. So this might be, I'm not exactly sure, it might be switching between 4th and 5th gear or something at the moment. I'm guessing that's the case. And that's back to the neutral position where nothing happens and things can turn again. So that's how the grooves in this barrel move this fork, and this barrel is being rotated every time you push the gear lever, the gear change lever, and it indexes around like a Gatling gun, and that's why I call it a rotating barrel with the grooves on it. Okay, that's all the selector forks set up on this pin. 1, 2, and the reverse one is down the bottom under there. The reverse one works on this reversing gear shift change, but it also has an interlock into the barrel, which is pretty difficult to show you, but it has to be in the barrel needs to be in neutral. The selector fork down there's got a pin that locates in this reversing cam, but it also has a pin that picks up a slot inside the barrel, and it only will allow that fork at the bottom there to move up when the barrel is in the neutral position. So look, I've run through all the gears there, everything's working fine. That's the neutral position at the moment, and that's the gear cluster assembled to the best of my knowledge, including the reversing idler on the other side. So now I'm going to move on to install the other shafts here. There's the sub-transmission output shaft here and the rear axle, and the crankshaft still to go before these cases can go together. So I'm pretty happy with this cluster. Getting that right is important. The others are relatively simple. These are the final drive gears. That spline there is where the universal joints push on both sides. This is the final pinion. The spline on here and the spline on here are where the two main transfer gears go, but they're outside of this centre case. They're in the left-hand side, under the left-hand side cover. So that's why those two shafts have got big splines on them. This shaft, as I worked out during the process, is actually the input shaft to the sequential gearbox, and it has a spline on that end of the shaft that the clutch fits on down that end. So all these shafts have got to be standing up like this, ready for the second half of the case to go on. So the next one is the crankshaft. The crankshaft has no direct connection to these shafts during the assembly of these two halves, because that end of the crankshaft is where the clutch stuff fits on, and then the clutches drive across to the input shaft of the sequential gearbox. So the crankshaft should be able to just spin there. Once the crankshaft's in place and I need to wash and prepare it, it should be ready to lower the other half of the case on, which I've got already there with all the bearings changed over. So this is coming along fairly quickly now. Oh, there's the crankshaft. Set up. This connecting rod has got no detectable play in and out like this. It's got a little bit of play, a little bit of movement. If I lift the whole thing up and down, we're talking fraction of a millimetre, and that's what is expected to have a little bit of play that way. In terms of this end of the crankshaft being able to wobble up and down, the only movement I'm feeling is the side-to-side play down the big end there. Look, the bearing, at the end of the day, this big end bearing feels perfect, so good enough. So that's half the crankcase loaded with parts, and I believe it's ready to take the other half being lowered down over the top of that. The book actually says to do it the other way around, load all these parts. This is the right-hand crankshaft down. The book actually says load all these parts into the left-hand crankshaft, crankcase. I'm not sure it makes any difference, but the sequential gearbox componentry, including the reversing gear and things, I think would all fall out if it was all turned over. And the barrel component of it is attached really to this left-hand crankcase, so it doesn't actually make sense to be loading it into the... am I wrong? Yeah, no, it doesn't make sense to be loading the stuff into the left-hand crankcase. I've loaded everything into the right-hand crankcase, and I'll be pushing the left-hand crankcase down over the top of it. Now I've got to get sealant organised for around the gap. There's no gasket there. It's supposed to be a very thin layer of RTV or something of that order, and there needs to be a couple of dowel pins put in. One of them's there and one of them's down the back corner there, and that's what I'll be proceeding with, and see how it goes. If it doesn't all just press together nicely, then you've got to stop and take it off again and see what's fouling. But I think we'll do all right, because I was able to push the two halves together when I reassembled temporarily the spare motor. I did that without a crankshaft in there, but I don't think the crankshaft's going to make any difference. I've knocked the two halves of the crankshaft together. Went on pretty easily. I used Permatax former gasket, a non-hardening pliable sealant. It is spewed out a little bit around the edges, hopefully making a good seal, hopefully an adequate material for the job. The important thing is I can rotate the back axle there, and that final drive is all running smooth. I can rotate the gearbox. You can see the two shafts rotating there, and they're nice and quiet, and there it is. So that's the crankshaft going around with the conrod going up and down. Some bolts in it. I'm going to go and have some lunch. Okay, this is where I'm going to leave it tonight. I've got all of the half case bolts in and not torqued up yet, but I've got a little bit of a protector there for the conrod, so I can spin the crankshaft and it feels good. I've got the oil pump back and repositioned and torqued up. I used the one out of the spare engine because I think metal had probably gone through the 94 engine. These are shafts from the spare engine. That's the input shaft to the sequential box that the clutch goes on. The clutch, centrifugal clutch basket goes on this one. The shift mechanism is in place there. That's where the odometer drive goes. There's oil seals to go in on the back axle. I've cleaned up the cap for the oil filler there, and cleaned up a drain plug there. Got the sieve all cleaned out, and so the next job is to assemble the sub transmission on this side. That's the crank spinning around and the conrod inside that plastic bottle to protect it. This is the output from the gearbox. This is the end of the input shaft to the sequential gearbox, but it's only really acting as an axle on this side. It spins, but two gears that are on bearings on here don't matter whether that's spinning or not. They act quite separately. So the output shaft still needs, the back axle needs an oil seal. All the bolts need to be tensioned down, but it's come up pretty clean. This is the end of the barrel with the fork slots in it. A pin goes in there which registers on a switch that bolts on here, showing where the neutral position is. The 5-speed gearbox shift lever passes through from the other side and sticks out this hole, shifting the sequential box. There's still a shift lever to go in one of these holes that works a fork on here to shift between the two speeds in the sub-transmission. But look, it's looking pretty bloody clean and functional in my mind. I've got little reason at the moment to think this is not going to be 100% when it's put together. So I'll leave it there and go and edit this video up. I'll have this running in the next few days. Get out to your shed and have some fun.